My name is Alina. I'm 29 years old, and for 6 years, my parents treated me like a walking ATM who didn't deserve a real seat at the family table. I kept telling myself that if I just kept a roof over their heads, they would finally love me the way they loved my sister. But the moment that finally broke the illusion came at my sister's engagement dinner. In front of 40 guests, my dad clinked his glass and announced he was gifting the family home to my sister and her new fiancé. He looked right at me, smirked, and said, "You'll have to pack your bags by the first, kiddo. They need the master bedroom." 40 people chuckled. My sister did a little happy dance, her diamond catching the chandelier light. I paid the property taxes. They hosted the parties. I fixed the roof. They treated me like a tenant who was lucky to be there. I kept that house standing, and he was taking it away acting like I had never belonged in it. I thought I just had to sit there and take the humiliation. I was wrong. My parents knew I had been paying the bank for years, but arrogance has a funny way of erasing details. They completely forgot why I was paying. They had no idea that when the house nearly went into foreclosure, I didn't just cover their debt, I legally bought the property. What happened next? It wasn't just going to ruin my sister's toast, it was going to leave my parents completely homeless. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back. To understand how my father could stand in a room full of people and give away the roof over my head, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Miller family. Growing up, there was a very clear map of who mattered. My sister, Chloe, was the son. She was the one who got the private piano lessons, the brand new cars, and the constant, gushing praise for simply existing. I was the moon, only visible when I was reflecting her light or providing a service. My role was established early. I was the responsible one. In our house, that was just a polite way of saying I was the person who did the work so everyone else could have the fun. I remember being 16, working 2 part-time jobs while Chloe spent her summers at expensive cheer camps. When I'd come home, my mother wouldn't ask how my shift went. She'd ask if I'd picked up Chloe's dry cleaning on the way back. The symbolic center of this dynamic was the guest book. My parents kept a leather-bound book on the entryway console of our family home, a sprawling 4-bedroom colonial that my grandfather had built. They loved to host. They loved the image of being the pillars of the community. Every time they had a dinner party or a holiday gathering, they made everyone sign it. If you look through those pages from the last decade, you'll see glowing notes about my mother's exquisite catering and my father's generosity. What you won't see in that book is me. I'm not in the photos. I'm the one taking the photos. I'm the one in the kitchen, making sure the hors d'oeuvres don't burn while my mother laughs with the neighbors. I'm the one who stayed up until 2:00 a.m. scrubbing red wine stains out of the carpet after Chloe's graduation party. To my parents, I wasn't a daughter, I was the infrastructure. The root wound, the thing that made the engagement dinner so devastating, started 6 years ago. My father, Gerald, has always been a man of grand gestures and very little follow-through. He worked in consulting, which was a vague term for waiting for a big payday that never seemed to arrive. He lived like a man with a 7-figure salary while his bank account was screaming in the red. One Tuesday evening, I came home to find my mother, Diane, sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. The house was dark. The power had been cut. It wasn't just a missed payment, it was a systemic collapse. My father had been using the house as a personal piggy bank, taking out second and third mortgages to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford. They were 3 months away from foreclosure. "Don't tell Chloe," was the first thing my mother said to me. "She's in the middle of her finals. She doesn't need the stress." I was 23. I had just started my career as a junior project manager at a construction firm. I had been saving every penny to move out, to finally have a space where I didn't have to check the chore list on the fridge. But looking at my mother in that dark kitchen, I felt that old, familiar pull of duty. I thought if I saved the house, I would finally earn my place in it. I thought my responsibility would finally be traded for respect. I sat down with my father that night. He didn't apologize, he didn't even look ashamed. He just handed me a stack of papers and said, "We're a little short this quarter, Alina. You've got that promotion coming up. It's only fair you contribute to the legacy." The legacy was a crumbling debt. I looked at the numbers and realized they didn't just need a contribution. They needed a miracle. I spent the next week talking to lenders, looking at the titles, and realizing that my father's credit was so incinerated that no bank would even speak to him. The house was going to be gone by Christmas. I made a choice then that I thought was an act of ultimate loyalty. I took my entire savings, the money meant for my own future, and I went to a real estate attorney. I didn't just bail them out. I made a deal. I would pay off the arrears, I would take over the primary mortgage, and in exchange, the title would be transferred to me. My father signed the papers with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Whatever keeps the lights on, Alina," he said. He didn't even read the fine print. To him, it was just a technicality, a bit of paperwork fluff to bypass the bank's unfair rules. In his mind, he was still the king, and I was just the treasurer. For the next 6 years, I lived in my childhood bedroom, the small one over the garage, while paying for the entire lifestyle of the people in the main house. I paid the property taxes. I paid the homeowner's insurance. When the water heater exploded, I was the one who called the plumber and handed over the credit card. When the roof leaked, I was the one on the ladder at 6:00 a.m. before heading to the office. And through it all, the hierarchy never shifted. Chloe moved back in for a year after a soul-searching trip to Europe that I indirectly funded by covering my parents' car payments. She was given the master suite because she needs her space to manifest her career. I was told to keep my work boots in the garage because they ruined the aesthetic of the entryway. I watched them sign that guest book, month after month, year after year. Neighbors would praise my father for the beautiful landscaping I spent my Saturdays maintaining. Friends would toast my mother for her lovely home. "We've worked hard to keep this place for the girls," my mother would say, her hand resting on Chloe's shoulder. "It's our sanctuary." I would stand in the kitchen, drying the dishes, listening to the clink of glasses I had bought in a house I legally owned, and I would wait for the thank you that never came. I stayed silent because I believed in the legacy. I believed that if I held the walls up, they would eventually notice I was the one standing under the weight. But as Chloe's engagement dinner approached, the air in the house changed. Chloe had met a man named Marcus. Marcus came from old money, the kind of money my father had always pretended to have. Suddenly, the Miller legacy wasn't just a house, it was a bargaining chip. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, I noticed my mother measuring the windows in my room. I found my father in the study, looking at architectural plans for a modern guest suite that replaced the garage. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the blueprint. My father didn't even look up from his glass of scotch. "Just some ideas for the future, Alina. We have to think about the family's image now that Marcus is joining us. We need more room for when the grandkids arrive." "Grandkids?" I asked. "Chloe isn't even married yet." "She will be," he said, his voice cold. "And she needs a proper foundation. Not everyone is as content to live like a hermit in a room over a garage, Alina. Some people have lives to build." I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. The arrogance was so thick it was blinding him. He had spent 6 years living on my dime, eating food I bought and sleeping under a roof I maintained, and he truly believed he was the one in charge of the foundation. He had forgotten that I didn't just pay for the house. I owned it. The first concrete damage didn't happen at the dinner. It happened 3 months before, during a Sunday lunch that I had, as usual, paid for and prepared. I was in the kitchen carving a roast when I heard my father's voice booming from the dining room. He was talking to Chloe and Marcus about investment portfolios. I walked in with the platter, and the conversation went dead silent. "Elena, darling, could you get the gray poupon?" "The fancy stuff," my mother said, not looking at me. "I don't think we have any," I said, setting the meat down. "I did the grocery run yesterday and it wasn't on the list." My father sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound. "This is what I mean, Marcus, details. Some people just don't have the mind for the finer details of estate management. It's why some people remain support staff." Marcus offered a tight, pitying smile. I felt the heat rise in my neck. I was the one who managed the property taxes, the sewage bills, and the structural repairs. I was the estate management. After lunch, while I was loading the dishwasher, my father called me into his study, a room filled with books he hadn't read and a mahogany desk I had polished the week before. "We need to talk about the transition," he said. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling a finger of scotch. "Chloe and Marcus are looking at properties, but frankly, nothing in their price range has the prestige of this zip code. It would be a blow to the family image if they ended up in a starter home in the suburbs." "What does that have to do with me?" I asked. "I've decided that you're going to stop paying the mortgage," he said, as if he were giving me a gift. "I'll take the payments back over. It's time I resumed my role as the head of the household." I stared at him. "Dad, you haven't had a steady contract in 2 years. How are you going to cover a $4,000 monthly payment?" He bristled, his face turning a mottled purple. "I have things in the works. Don't you dare question my providence. The point is, since I'll be paying, I'll be the one deciding who lives here. Chloe needs the space for her brand. She's an influencer, Elena. She needs the aesthetic. You're a project manager. You spend your life on dirty construction sites. You don't need a 4-bedroom legacy house." "I own the house, Dad," I said, my voice trembling. He laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "On paper, maybe, to satisfy the bank's little bureaucratic nightmare years ago, but we all know the truth. This is the Miller house. My father built it. I raised you in it. You were just the custodian for a while. Now I'm taking the keys back." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a document. It was a quitclaim deed. He had already filled it out. He wanted me to sign the house back over to him for $10 and love and affection. "Sign it," he commanded. "Before the engagement dinner." I want to be able to tell Marcus's father that the estate is firmly in my hands. It looks better for the merger of the families. "No," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. My father didn't scream. He didn't move. He just looked at me with a cold, clinical detachedness that hurt more than a shout. "I see," he whispered. 6 years of us letting you stay here, letting you feel like you were part of the inner circle, and this is the thanks we get. Greed." The next day, I came home from work to find the locks had been changed. My key turned halfway and stopped. I knocked, and my mother opened the door only a crack. She looked haggard, but her eyes were hard. "Your father is very hurt, Elena," she said. "He says if you want to act like a landlord, you can start living like one, somewhere else." "My clothes are in there, Mom. My laptop, my life is in there." "We'll put your things in the garage," she said. "You can come by on Saturday to pick them up. But until you sign those papers and show some respect for this family, you aren't welcome at the table." I spent the night in a motel down the street. I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like stale cigarettes and realized that the damage wasn't just the loss of my home. It was the realization that my parents had been counting down the days until they could discard me. The most painful part came 3 days later. I received an email from my boss at the construction firm. "Elena, we had a very disturbing call from your father today. He claims you've been using company resources to steal family property and that you're in a legal dispute over elder abuse. We need to put you on administrative leave while we look into this. We can't have our senior PMs embroiled in character scandals. My father hadn't just locked me out. He was trying to cut off the very income I used to pay for the roof over his head. He was willing to ruin my career to force my hand. I went to the garage on Saturday to get my things. My boxes were stacked haphazardly near the oil stains. As I loaded my car, I saw Chloe through the kitchen window. She was laughing, holding a glass of wine, pointing at a swatch of wallpaper she wanted to change in what used to be my room. She didn't even look at me. To her, I was already gone. I was just a ghost who had finished its chores. I drove away with my heart in my throat, but I didn't go to a lawyer yet. I went to the bank. I wanted to see exactly how much of his house my father thought he was giving away. When the clerk pulled up the records, she frowned. "Miss Miller, did you know there's been an inquiry into a title transfer? Someone tried to file a lost title affidavit yesterday." My father was trying to bypass me entirely. He was trying to erase my existence from the county records. That was the moment I stopped being the daughter who saved them. I became the owner who would finish them. The cost of my father's arrogance didn't just stay within the four walls of the house. It started bleeding into my professional life, threatening the career I had spent a decade building. Being placed on administrative leave was a public branding of untrustworthy. In the construction industry, reputation is the only currency that actually matters. If a project manager is accused of legal malpractice or family theft, word travels through the subcontractors and site foremen like a brush fire. I spent my first week of exile in a cramped studio apartment, the kind of place my father would have sneered at. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart hammered against my ribs, fearing it was my boss calling to make the suspension permanent. Instead, it was usually my mother. "Elena, just sign the papers," she'd say, her voice echoing with the sound of a vacuum cleaner in the background, my vacuum cleaner. "Your father is losing sleep. He's had to go on blood pressure medication because of the stress you're causing. Is a piece of property really worth killing your own father?" The emotional blackmail was a practiced routine, but this time there was a new layer of cruelty. They weren't just asking for the house, they were actively stripping my identity to make room for Chloe's. On Wednesday, I saw a post on Chloe's Instagram. She was standing in my old bedroom, the one I had painstakingly painted and carpeted with my own hands. The caption read, "Starting the renovations for the bridal suite. So blessed to have a family that preserves our legacy. Can't wait to host the first brunch here." She had already thrown away my desk. I could see it in the background of her haul video, sitting by the curb next to a pile of my old professional journals and a pair of my steel-toed work boots. They weren't just moving me out, they were erasing the evidence that I had ever contributed anything. But the escalation reached its peak when I received a formal letter from a local law firm. My father hadn't just tried to file a lost title affidavit. He had filed a lawsuit against me for constructive trust. He was claiming that the money I used to buy the house was actually his money, that he had given it to me to hold in a trust, and that I had treacherously put the deed in my own name. He was lying under oath. He was claiming that a man who couldn't pay his electric bill 6 years ago had somehow handed his 23-year-old daughter 6 figures in cash. I went to the house that evening. I didn't try the door. I stood on the sidewalk, the shadow of the great oak tree stretching across the lawn. The sprinklers were on, a luxury I usually rationed during the dry months to save on the utility bill. My father was standing on the porch with Marcus's father, a man named Arthur who owned half the commercial real estate in the county. "Yes, it's been in the family for generations," my father was saying, gesturing broadly to the porch. "We had a bit of a clerical hiccup with my eldest, but it's all being rectified. Chloe and Marcus will have the deed as a wedding gift." A clean start for the new branch of the Miller tree. Arthur nodded, looking impressed. "Generational wealth is the only true security, Gerald. Good on you for protecting it." My father spotted me then. He didn't flinch. He didn't look guilty. He simply raised his glass of scotch toward me in a mocking toast, a silent signal that he believed he had already won. He thought that by attacking my job and my reputation, he would starve me out until I had no choice but to sign the quitclaim just to survive. He forgot one thing. In my years as a project manager, I didn't just build houses. I built paper trails. I realized then that the damage wasn't just the house or the job. They were trying to take my truth. They wanted the world to believe I was a thief so they could continue to be the pillars of the community on my dime. I looked at the house, the roof I'd fixed, the taxes I'd paid, the guest book sitting inside that didn't have my name in it. I realized I didn't want the house anymore. I wanted the math to be settled. I turned away from the porch and called the one person who knew exactly where every cent had come from. My father thought he was playing a game of family legacy. He didn't realize I was playing a game of forensic accounting. I wasn't completely alone in that motel room, though it felt like it. The one person who hadn't signed the Miller guest book, out of obligation, was a man named Silas. Silas was 74 years old, a retired surveyor who had worked with my grandfather when the house was first built. He lived 3 doors down in a house that looked like a smaller, humbler version of ours. When Silas heard my father had changed the locks, he didn't call me to offer platitudes. He showed up at my motel with a thermos of coffee and a weathered leather satchel. "Elena," he said, sitting in the only armchair in the room, "your father is a man who confuses volume with value. He thinks if he screams 'legacy' loud enough, the dirt under the house will believe him. But dirt doesn't have ears. It has records." Silas had been my quiet observer for years. He was the one who saw me on the roof at dawn. He was the one who noticed that every time a contractor's truck parked in the driveway, it was my car that followed them to the bank to settle the bill. "He's telling the neighborhood you're a squatter, Elena," Silas said softly. "He told the HOA last night that you were disturbed and that he was doing a mercy eviction to save the family name before the wedding." The betrayal was widening. It wasn't just my job or my house anymore. It was my sanity. My father was building a narrative where I was the villain so that when he finally handed Chloe the keys, the world would applaud him for reclaiming his home from a wayward daughter. "I have something for you," Silas said. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a series of survey maps and site logs from 6 years ago, the year the house almost went into foreclosure. When your father was trying to get those second mortgages, he had to have the land resurveyed. He tried to claim the property lines extended into the municipal grove to inflate the value. I was the one who caught him. I kept my notes, Elena, and I kept the correspondence from the bank he tried to defraud. Silas wasn't just an ally, he was a witness to the very first lie. He knew that 6 years ago my father hadn't just been short on cash. He had been caught in a cycle of financial fraud that only stopped because I stepped in and bought the deed. "He thinks you're just a girl with a piece of paper," Silas told me, his eyes sharp and steady. "He forgets that you're a project manager. You don't just see the house. You see the load-bearing walls. And he, Elena, is a termite." Silas didn't offer to pay my legal fees or house me forever. Instead, he gave me something better, a perspective that wasn't clouded by a daughter's need for love. He helped me see that my family wasn't a system I was failing. It was a business I had been subsidizing. With Silas's notes and my own digital records, we spent the next 3 nights in that motel room. We weren't looking for emotional closure. We were looking for the double entry. In construction, we have a term for when a contractor bills two different clients for the same bag of cement. It's called double dipping, and it's a crime. I realized that my father had been doing the same thing. He was telling Marcus's family he owned the estate to secure a high society marriage for Chloe, while simultaneously telling the court I was a trustee of his secret money to avoid the reality of his own bankruptcy. He's trapped himself in a pincer move, Silas noted, pointing at the dates on the court filings and the wedding invitations. He can't be a wealthy patriarch in one room and a penniless victim of a treacherous daughter in the other. Eventually, he has to choose which lie to tell under oath. Having Silas there changed the math of my grief. I stopped crying about the bedroom furniture Chloe had thrown away. I started focusing on the guest list for the engagement dinner. Silas reminded me that my father's power came from the audience in that guest book, the neighbors, the prestigious in-laws, the local business owners. He needs them to believe the story, Silas said. So let's give them the full edition. By the end of part 4, I had a place to stay, Silas's guest room, and a plan that had nothing to do with begging for my room back. I had backup. For the first time in my life, someone was standing under the weight with me, and he was handing me the blueprints for the demolition. The transformation of a hidden truth into a weapon doesn't happen in a single flash of realization. It happens in the quiet, tedious work of verification. While my father was busy picking out the vintage of champagne for Chloe's engagement dinner, I was sitting in the back of the county record's office with a woman named Brenda who had seen 40 years of family feuds pass across her desk. "You're looking for the original conveyance," Brenda said, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "If your father is claiming he put the money in a trust, there has to be a recorded trust indenture or a gift letter filed with the deed. If it's not here, it didn't happen in the eyes of the law." We searched for 3 hours. We found the 1978 deed when my grandfather bought the land. We found the 1995 transfer to my father. And then we found the 2018 special warranty deed. My name was there, clear as day. Alina Miller, sole owner. There was no mention of a trust, no mention of a life estate for my parents, no gift letter from my father. In fact, there was something better. There was the statement of value filed with the state. It showed the purchase price I paid to the bank to stop the foreclosure. It wasn't a gift from my father. It was a market rate transaction that saved the bank from seizing the asset. "He's not just lying to you, honey," Brenda whispered, sliding the certified copy across the counter. "He lied to the court in that lawsuit. This document proves he had no equity left to give you. You didn't take a trust, you bought a liability." I held that paper in my hand, and I felt the weight of 6 years of gaslighting finally start to lift. But the real activation of the proof came when I visited the bank that held the original mortgage. Because I was the owner, I had access to the full history of the account. I sat down with a loan officer and asked for the records of who had physically made the payments for the last 72 months. "It's all from one account," the officer said, tapping his screen. "An external transfer from an account ending in 4492. Name on the account, Alina Miller." I asked him to print every single one. 72 months of proof that my father hadn't contributed a single cent to the legacy he was currently trying to gift to Chloe. He had been living in a house I paid for, using electricity I paid for, and now he was using my own money to hire a lawyer to sue me. I took those 2 folders, the certified deed and the 72 months of payment stubs, and I went back to Silas. "This is the skeleton," Silas said, looking through the stack. "But we need the muscle. We need the proof that he knows he's lying. We need him to admit it." "He'll never admit it to me," I said. "He hasn't spoken a word to me since he locked the door." "He won't admit it to you. Silas agreed. But he'll admit it to Marcus's father. He's so desperate to look like a patriarch that he'll brag about his cleverness if he thinks he has an audience of equals. Silas helped me set the final piece of the trap. He knew the contractor my father had hired to renovate my room into Chloe's bridal suite. The contractor, a man named Miller, no relation, who had worked for my firm before, was furious because my father's check for the deposit had bounced. He's telling the contractor the trust is being settled and the funds will be released after the engagement dinner, Silas told me. I called the contractor. I didn't ask him to quit. I asked him to do his job. Go ahead with the estimate, I told him, but record the consultation. If he mentions who owns the house or how he's paying for it, I need to hear it. 2 days later, I got the audio file. My father's voice was unmistakable, booming, arrogant, and devastatingly clear. The girl thinks she has a claim because her name is on the deed for the bank's sake, but she's just a placeholder, my father told the contractor. I've got her tied up in a lawsuit that'll take years. By the time it's over, Chloe will have lived here for half a decade. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and I'm the one holding the gavel. Just get the suite ready. I'll have the cash once I finish squeezing the trust out of her. He had admitted on tape that the trust was a fabrication intended to squeeze me. He had admitted he knew my name was on the deed and that he was using a frivolous lawsuit to stall for time. The truth was no longer just a memory of a dark kitchen 6 years ago. It was a certified, recorded, and audible fact. I wasn't just the responsible daughter anymore. I was the one holding the detonator to the Miller legacy. The week of the engagement dinner, the house felt like a stage being dressed for a play I was no longer cast in. From Silas's porch, I watched the rental trucks arrive. White linens, gold-rimmed chairs, and massive floral arrangements of lilies and white roses, my mother's favorite, and also the most expensive, were carried through the front door. I knew exactly what the bill for those flowers looked like because the florist, thinking I was still the primary contact, had emailed the invoice to me. $3,000 for a legacy celebration. My father hadn't paid it. He told them the estate account would settle it on Monday. He was gambling everything on the idea that once the engagement was public and the families were merged, I wouldn't dare cause a scene that would humiliate him in front of Marcus's wealthy father. He was right about one thing. I didn't want a scene. I wanted a settlement. 3 days before the dinner, I made my logistical move. I didn't call a lawyer. I called the utility companies. Since the accounts were in my name and the house was legally mine, I had every right to manage them. I didn't shut them off. That would be petty. Instead, I put them on tenant notification status. It meant that any change to the service or any overdue balance would trigger a physical notice taped to the front door. Next was the emotional move. I sent a single text to my mother. I'm coming to the dinner to get the rest of my things from the garage. I'll stay out of the way. She replied instantly. Your father says you can come, but only if you dress appropriately and don't mention the dispute. We've told everyone you're transitioning to a new role in the city. Keep the lie, Alina, for Chloe's sake. They weren't just inviting me, they were casting me. I was to be the supportive older sister who was gracefully stepping aside for the new couple. It was the ultimate gaslight. They wanted me to witness my own erasure and smile for the photos. Finally, the risk move. I met with Silas one last time. He handed me a small, high-capacity USB drive and a physical folder. The audio from the contractor is on here, Silas said, and the forensic audit of the mortgage payments. I also spoke to the HOA board. They were under the impression you were being evicted for non-payment. When I showed them your ledger, the president of the board nearly choked on his coffee. Is it enough? I asked. It's more than enough, Silas said. But remember, Alina, your father's greatest strength is his audience. He spent 30 years building a house of cards. You don't need to kick it. You just need to show the audience the tape holding it together. On the night of the dinner, I didn't wear my work boots. I wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit, the kind I wore to board meetings when I was negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. I looked like the owner of a company, not a girl who lived over a garage. As I pulled into the driveway, the house was glowing. Music drifted out of the open windows. I saw my father through the glass, standing in the center of the living room, holding a crystal glass, laughing with Marcus's father. He looked like the king of the castle. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the garage as I'd promised, but I didn't pick up boxes. I checked my phone. The tenant notification had been triggered. A bright orange notice of owner action was currently being taped to the front door by a courier I'd hired, a legal requirement for the notice to quit I had filed that morning. The countdown hit 0. I smoothed my jacket, tucked the folder under my arm, and walked toward the front porch. I could hear my father's voice rising for the big announcement. "And now," he boomed, "a toast to the future of this house and the couple who will carry the Miller name into the next generation." I stepped into the foyer just as the room erupted in applause. My father spotted me, his smile wavering for a fraction of a second, but then he straightened his tie. He thought I was there to play my part. He had no idea I had rewritten the script. The engagement dinner wasn't held in the dining room. My father had insisted on the backyard, under the sprawling oak tree where I'd spent my Saturdays weeding and mulching. He'd rented a transparent marquee and hung thousands of fairy lights. It looked like a fairy tale, provided you didn't look at the foundation. I stood at the edge of the lawn, clutching my folder. My father was mid-toast, his voice thick with the performance of a lifetime. "And so," he said, gesturing to the house behind him, "as Marcus and Chloe begin their journey, Diane and I want to ensure they have the same solid ground we've enjoyed. We are officially gifting this estate, the Miller family seat, to the happy couple, effective on their wedding day." The guests cheered. Marcus's father, Arthur, stood up and shook my father's hand. A magnificent gesture, Gerald, truly. "I have something to add to the toast," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden quiet of the night air it carried. 40 heads turned. My mother's face went white, Chloe's smile froze. "Alina, not now," my father hissed, his eyes darting to Arthur. "We're in the middle of a celebration. Go back to the garage." "I just wanted to share the history of the house with our new family," I said, walking toward the head table. I didn't look like a disgruntled daughter. I looked like a woman presenting a project status report. I handed the first copy of the special warranty deed to Arthur. Then I handed one to Marcus. "What is this?" Arthur asked, frowning as he looked at the legal seal. "It's the title," I said calmly. "It shows that 6 years ago this house was in foreclosure. My father couldn't pay the debt. I bought it from the bank with my own savings. I am the sole owner. I have been for 2,190 days." "She's lying," my father shouted, slamming his glass onto the table. "She's a trustee. She's been holding that money for me in a private arrangement." I didn't argue. I simply pulled out the second folder, the 72 months of bank statements. I laid them out on the linen tablecloth like a deck of cards. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every cent of the homeowner's insurance has come from my personal salary, I said. "If there was a trust, Dad, where is the gift letter? Where is the trust indenture? Why does the bank only have my signature on the liability?" The room went deathly still. I saw a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, lean over to look at the bank statements. She'd signed that guest book for years. She looked at my father, then back at the papers, and her expression shifted from confusion to disgust. "Gerald," Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous, "is this true? You're gifting a property you don't even own." "It's a family matter, Arthur, a technicality," my father sputtered. Alina is just being difficult because she's jealous of her sister. I'm not jealous, Dad, I said. I pulled out my phone and tapped the play button on the audio file Sela's and I had prepared. The speakers I'd helped set up for the music now carried my father's own voice across the lawn. The girl thinks she has a claim because her name is on the deed, but she's just a placeholder. I'll have the cash once I finish squeezing the trust out of her. The recording played to the end. The sound of the crickets in the yard seemed deafening in the silence that followed. Chloe started to cry, but it wasn't a happy dance cry. It was the sound of a woman realizing her influencer lifestyle was built on sand. Marcus stepped back from her, his face a mask of cold realization. You told us you were a man of means, Gerald, Arthur said, standing up. He didn't look at my father, he looked at me. I apologize, Alina, we were told you were unwell. I'm a project manager, Arthur, I said, meeting his eyes. I deal in structural integrity, and this family has none. The room broke. Not with a bang, but with the sound of chairs scraping against the patio. People didn't stay for the cake. They didn't sign the guest book. They walked out in pairs, whispering, leaving my parents standing under their fairy lights in a house they no longer had any right to inhabit. I walked over to the front door. I reached up and peeled the orange, notice to quit off the wood. I handed it to my father. The locks were changed once, I said quietly. On Monday, they'll be changed again. You have 30 days to find a place you can actually afford. I didn't wait for him to respond. I walked past my mother, who was sitting in a gold-rimmed chair, staring at the empty lawn. I walked out to my car where Sela's was waiting at the end of the driveway. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt light. For the first time in 6 years, I wasn't carrying the Miller legacy. I was just Alina, and I was going home. The fallout was swift and unsentimental. Marcus broke off the engagement 3 days later. His family's lawyers sent a formal letter to my father, citing misrepresentation of assets and terminating any further social or financial association between the families. Chloe's influencer career didn't survive the local gossip. She ended up deleting her accounts after the audio of our father's plan went viral in our small town. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the far side of the county. I didn't pay for the movers. I didn't help them pack. On the day they finally left, I walked through the empty house. The guest book was still on the console, forgotten in the rush. I took it out to the fire pit in the backyard and watched the pages of fake praise turn to ash. I still own the house, but I don't live there anymore. The memories of being a placeholder were too thick in the air. I sold it to a young family, a couple who actually looked at each other with respect. I used the equity to buy a smaller place closer to my office, with a porch that doesn't need a legacy to feel sturdy. Sometimes, at night, I sit in my new kitchen and listen to the silence. It's not the lonely silence of the room over the garage. It's the quiet of a life that finally belongs to me. I learned that you can't build a home on someone else's lies, no matter how much of your own blood and sweat you pour into the foundation. Today, Sela's and I are working on a community garden project. He's still checking the survey lines, and I'm still managing the budget. But now, when we finish a day's work, we sit down as equals. That's my story. It's not a fairy tale, and there wasn't a magical reconciliation. But there is peace. And in the end, that's the only legacy worth keeping. If you've ever felt like a guest in your own life, or if you've been the one holding up the roof for people who wouldn't even give you a seat at the table, how did you finally find your voice? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you reclaimed your foundation. If this story meant something to you, check out my other video about family boundaries, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of truth and resilience.